If you vanished tomorrow, no one would even notice, my son said, as the whole table burst into laughter. That was the exact moment I decided to walk away. I disappeared without a word. 3 days later, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Call after call kept coming in. More than 30 missed calls stacked up, and suddenly, I was the one they couldn't stop searching for. The biting wind off Lake Michigan, a brutal, icy whip, slammed against the penthouse window with the force of a desperate fist. Then a sharp crack, followed by the terrifying cascade of shattering glass. A heavy brick, wrapped in duct tape like some crude, ancient weapon, tumbled onto the plush Persian rug, scattering crystalline shards across the pristine surface. It wasn't just an object, it was a message. A stark, undeniable proclamation of menace. And in that moment, as the cold air rushed into the luxurious suite, as my security detail, Tony, tackled me to the ground, I felt a strange, cold clarity. A smile, thin and sharp as a surgeon's blade, touched my lips. Pay or bleed, the note taped to the brick read. The son signed, but the mother pays. 24 hours. Believe it or not, this wasn't the worst thing that had happened to me this week. Not even close. Because, you see, this was a consequence. This was the unavoidable fallout from a decision made just days earlier, a decision born from a quiet, suffocating rage. A rage that had simmered for years, finally ignited by a single, casual, brutal sentence from my own son, Derek. If you disappeared tomorrow, he'd said, mid-chew on a turkey leg I'd paid for, in a house I'd bought, no one would miss you. And everyone around the Thanksgiving table, my daughter-in-law Vanessa, his aunts, even some of my so-called friends, they had all laughed. Wait. Let that sink in for a moment. Laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, but a collective, entitled, dismissive burst of amusement. That was it. That was the moment I chose to disappear. Not physically, not entirely, but from their lives. From being their convenient, ever-present ATM. 3 days later, my phone would not stop ringing. 30 missed calls. Suddenly, I was the one they were desperate to find. But by then, the locks were changed. The bank accounts frozen. And I was sipping vintage Bordeaux in this very penthouse suite, watching their world crumble through a security camera feed. That sentence, that casual cruelty, it ended my life as a mother, as their mother, at least, and it started my war for redemption. And honestly, it's probably the best decision I've ever made. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled their fake lives, let me introduce myself. My name is Margaret Thornton. My friends, the few I have left who don't want something from me, call me Maggie. I'm 73 years old, and for 50 of those years, I built skyscrapers in Chicago. I know how to pour concrete so it lasts 100 years. I know how to spot a crack in a foundation before the whole building comes down. I just never thought the biggest crack would be right here, in my own family. And I certainly never expected it to be my own son. It was Thanksgiving evening in Lake Forest, Illinois. The wind howled outside, a bitter symphony off Lake Michigan, dropping the temperature to a brutal 2 degrees. But inside the sprawling Georgian-style mansion, the air was suffocating, thick with unspoken resentments and the sickly sweet scent of false cheer. I sat at the head of the dining table, a massive McCraftsman I'd acquired from a Polish estate 2 decades ago. It was a piece of history, an heirloom. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, 35 and self-described lifestyle influencer, had covered its rich, dark wood with a cheap, sequined runner. The wood looks too old-fashioned, Maggie, she'd chirped, never calling me Mom or Mrs. Thornton anymore, just Maggie. Like I was the hired help, not the matriarch who paid for the very air she breathed. Vanessa was currently holding her phone aloft, angling for the perfect lighting for her Instagram story. Move over, Maggie, she'd hissed, without even glancing my way. You're ruining the aesthetic. I shifted my chair. The heavy wood scraped loudly against the polished floor, the sound echoing through the cavernous dining room like a complaint. A very appropriate complaint, actually. I looked down at my plate. The turkey was dry, the stuffing clearly store-bought. For a meal that was supposed to be about gratitude, The room was overflowing with an almost palpable sense of entitlement. My son, Derek, 40 years old, sat to my right, scrolling through his phone in a cashmere sweater that cost more than my first car. He was probably checking the likes on Vanessa's latest post, completely oblivious to the bitter undercurrents. Derek was the director of sales at a mid-sized logistics firm. He believed, truly, deeply, that he'd secured this position through his own charisma and business acumen. He had no idea, not the slightest clue, that I owned 40% of that very company. No idea that his exorbitant salary was essentially my dividends, repackaged and laundered, so he wouldn't feel like a charity case. I see now that this was my first, most critical mistake. I enabled his delusion, creating a comfortable bubble that shielded him from reality. Educational Anchor 1. The Perils of Unchecked Entitlement. This scene, this entire dynamic, is a textbook example of how unchecked privilege and a lack of earned struggle can breed profound entitlement, or what some psychologists call affluenza. When individuals are consistently insulated from the consequences of their actions, when success is handed to them rather than forged, they develop a distorted sense of reality. They believe their comfort is a birthright, their lavish lifestyle a natural state, and anyone challenging that, especially a provider like Maggie, becomes an obstacle, an annoyance, rather than a benefactor. They lose the capacity for gratitude because they've never truly experienced want. This isn't just about money, it's about a warped sense of personal agency and responsibility. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me back to the stifling present. I pulled it out, expecting a holiday message from an old friend. Instead, it was a fraud alert from American Express. A charge of $45,000 had just cleared. The merchant name was vaguely listed as Elite Lifestyle Consulting. I knew that name. It was a shell merchant, often used by high-end spas and boutiques downtown to mask extravagant purchases from nosy husbands. Or, in this case, from nosy mothers-in-law who actually paid the bills. A vein throbbed in my temple. $45,000. In 1 month. That was more than I'd earned in my first 3 years in construction. I looked at Derek. He was pouring himself a glass of vintage Cabernet, a rare bottle from my private collection that I'd been saving for my 75th birthday. He didn't even ask. He just took it. I cleared my throat, the sound rough, like gravel. Derek, I said, keeping my voice level, a monumental effort. I see a charge here on the black card. $45,000. Care to explain why your consulting fees look suspiciously like a shopping spree on the Magnificent Mile? The clinking of silverware stopped abruptly. The room went dead silent. Vanessa lowered her phone, her ring light reflecting not annoyance, but pure, unadulterated rage in her eyes. "Oh my God, are we doing this now?" she groaned, throwing her napkin onto the table. "It's Thanksgiving, Maggie. Can you just not be a miser for one night? It's embarrassing." I ignored her, keeping my gaze fixed on my son. "I asked you a question, Derek. You told me you needed that card for emergency house repairs. Since when is a handbag an emergency?" Derek slammed his wine glass down. Red liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth like blood. "Mom, stop. Just stop." His voice was rising, a petulant, entitled scream. "You're always watching. Always counting every single penny. It's exhausting. You have millions sitting in the bank doing nothing, literally rotting away in accounts. We're trying to build a life here. We're building a brand. Vanessa needs to maintain a certain image for her career." He leaned forward, his face flushed with wine and a lifetime of being told yes. "You wouldn't understand," he sneered, "because you still think like a poor immigrant contractor." The words hung in the air between us, venomous and deliberate. I understood plenty. I understood that I was looking at a man who had never calloused his hands a day in his life. I understood that I had, through my own misguided love and desire to spare him hardship, created this monster. I stood up slowly. My knees popped, a stark reminder of the years I'd spent carrying lumber and laying brick. "I'm cutting the card, Derek. And I'm auditing the last year of expenses. This ends tonight. That was the moment the atmosphere shifted from tense to dangerous. Derek stood up, too. He was taller than me now, softer, but taller. His face was flushed not just with wine, but with something darker, a rage that had been simmering, patiently waiting, for years. "You know what your problem is, Mom," he shouted, spitting the words out. "You think money makes you queen? You think because you wrote the check you own us." He took a step closer, the expensive wine on his breath clashing with his cheap words. "Well, guess what? You don't. You're just a sad, lonely old woman clutching onto your wallet because it's the only thing that makes you feel relevant." I stood there, silent, letting his words hang, letting them cut. "You're a burden," Derek continued, his voice rising to a scream that echoed off the high ceilings. "You come here, you complain about the food, you complain about the money, you complain about how we live. You're a dark cloud over this family." He pointed his finger at me like a weapon. "Frankly, you're just a ghost haunting this house. You're a walking ATM, and the service fees are getting too high." I looked at Vanessa. She was giggling, a cruel, sharp sound that sliced through the room. She looked at her husband with admiration, as if he'd just slain a dragon instead of gutting the woman who paid for the roof over their heads. I looked around the room. The crystal chandelier I'd bought, the paintings I'd selected, the walls I'd paid to have painted. Everything here was mine. Yet I was the intruder. I looked at the dry turkey on my plate one last time. I took my linen napkin, folded it neatly into a perfect square, and placed it beside the silverware. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I didn't list the sacrifices I'd made, the 18-hour days, the missed birthdays, the frozen fingers on construction sites in February. There was no point. They were deaf to reality. I simply turned and walked toward the front door. "Where are you going, old woman?" Derek shouted after me, his voice echoing in the marble foyer. "Going to cry in your truck? Go ahead, leave. But don't expect me to call and beg you to come back. We're going to enjoy the rest of this night without your negativity." I opened the heavy oak front door. The wind from the lake hit me like a physical blow, biting through my thin dress blouse. It was freezing, a deadly kind of cold. My heavy wool coat was hanging in the hall. I didn't stop to get it. If I turned back now, if I hesitated for even a second, I might lose the resolve that was hardening in my chest like concrete setting in winter. I walked out into the night. The gravel of the driveway crunched under my dress shoes. I walked past Derek's Porsche Cayenne, past Vanessa's Range Rover, both leased under my company name. I walked to the end of the driveway where my 2015 Ford F-150 was parked. It was the only thing I owned that they despised. An eyesore, they called it. They'd asked me to park it on the street so the neighbors wouldn't see it. I climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was freezing. The engine groaned as I turned the key, struggling against the cold before roaring to life. I sat there for a moment, watching the warm glow of the house windows. I could see their silhouettes moving in the dining room. They were pouring more wine. They were laughing. They were celebrating their victory. They thought this was just another fight. They thought I would drive around the block, cool off, and come back tomorrow with my checkbook open, ready to apologize for ruining their mood. They thought I was trapped by my love for them. They were wrong. I put the truck into gear and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. My hands were shaking, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. It wasn't from the cold. It was from a rage so pure and so cold, it felt like clarity. I drove toward the highway, and as the mansion disappeared behind me, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number. It was Thanksgiving night, but I knew she would answer. Catherine Sterling, my attorney. A shark in a Chanel suit, a woman I'd trusted with my life for 30 years. She answered on the second ring. "Maggie, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "No, Catherine," I said, my voice steady as steel. "It's time. Initiate Protocol Omega." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a heavy silence that spoke volumes. We had drafted Protocol Omega 5 years ago, after my husband passed away. It was a nuclear option, A contingency plan designed for a worst-case scenario where I needed to liquidate and sever ties immediately. We used to joke about it, calling it the doomsday button. "Maggie, are you sure?" Catherine asked, her voice losing its professional edge. "Once I start this, there's no undo button. The assets will be frozen. The cards will be cancelled. The access codes will be wiped. It's scorched earth." I looked at the road ahead of me, illuminated by my headlights cutting through the darkness. I thought about the $45,000 charge. I thought about the laughter at the table. I thought about my son telling me I was a ghost. "I'm sure," I said. "Cut everything. The credit cards, the bank accounts, the utility auto pay, the company access. Everything. Right now. I want them to wake up tomorrow in a world where I don't exist." "Consider it done," Catherine said. I could hear her moving already, opening her laptop. "Where will you be?" "I'm checking into the Ritz-Carlton downtown. Book me the penthouse suite. And Catherine, hire private security. I don't want anyone to know I'm there." "Understood. I'll call the bank now. Goodbye, Maggie." I hung up the phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I merged onto the interstate, heading toward the Chicago skyline, glowing in the distance against the black November sky. I turned on the radio, letting classic rock drown out the silence. My son wanted me to disappear. He wanted a world where he was the man of the house, where his success was his own, where I was just a memory gathering dust. "Well, Derek," I thought, "you're about to find out exactly how expensive it is to be a man. You wanted me gone? I'm gone. And I'm taking every single dollar with me." 3 days of silence. A long time, when you're accustomed to noise. For 3 days, I sat in the penthouse suite of the Ritz-Carlton, watching the snow fall over Chicago. I ordered room service, filet mignon, lobster bisque, bottles of wine I'd never let myself enjoy before, because I was always saving for Derek's future. I slept in a bed that didn't feel like a coffin. I watched movies. I read books. And I watched them. I had installed the security system in the Lake Forest house myself 5 years ago. Top of the line. High-definition cameras in the common areas, motion sensors on the windows, and a direct feed I could access from my iPad. For the first 2 days, they were confused, but arrogantly so. I watched them pace around the living room, check the driveway, waiting for my truck to reappear. They thought I was staying at a motel down the road, cooling off. They thought I was punishing them with my absence, but that I would return the moment I got lonely. They ate the Thanksgiving leftovers. They drank the wine I'd left behind. They laughed about my temper tantrum. But today was Monday. Monday meant reality. And reality is expensive. I sat in the velvet armchair by the window, the iPad propped on my knees. I wasn't watching the house feed anymore. I was watching the transaction alerts on my banking app, or rather, the decline alerts. It started at 11 a.m. Vanessa, deciding she needed retail therapy to cope with the stress of her mother-in-law walking out, drove the Range Rover down to the Magnificent Mile, Chicago's premier shopping district. I knew exactly where she was going, Chanel. It was her sanctuary. I imagined the scene as clearly as if I were standing next to her. She would walk in, chin held high, designer sunglasses perched on her head, expecting the staff to fawn over her. She was a VIP client, after all. Or at least, she was a VIP client when I was paying the bill. I saw the alert pop up on my screen. Attempted charge, $12,400. Merchant, Chanel Boutique. Status, declined. Reason, card reported stolen. I took a sip of my wine, a 2010 Bordeaux, smooth and heavy. I savored the taste while I pictured what was happening inside that store. Vanessa would be confused at first. She would laugh that nervous little laugh she did when things didn't go her way. She would tell the sales associate to try again. "It must be a chip error," she'd say, tapping her manicured nails on the glass counter. The associate would try again. Declined. Code 10. That's the code that tells the merchant to call the bank. And the bank would tell them to confiscate the card. I could see it in my mind. The security guard stepping forward, a large man in a dark suit. He would ask for the card politely but firmly. Vanessa would protest. She would raise her voice. "Do you know who I am?" She would scream. "My mother-in-law is Margaret Thornton, a successful businesswoman." But the guard wouldn't care. He would take that black titanium card, the symbol of her status, the key to her fake life, and he would take a pair of heavy scissors from behind the counter. Snip. Just like that, she was nobody. She would be standing there, surrounded by the things she coveted, with the eyes of other shoppers burning into her back. The humiliation would be absolute. She would have to walk out of that store empty-handed. No bag, no receipt, just the burning shame of rejection in front of Chicago's elite. She called Derek immediately. I saw the call come through on the phone logs I had access to through the family plan I paid for. She would be screaming, crying, demanding he fix it. She would tell him to call me. But she didn't know that Derek was having a bad morning too. I switched the view on my iPad to the GPS tracker on the Porsche Cayenne. Technology is wonderful when you're the one who set up all the accounts. Derek was at a Shell station off the expressway. The tank was empty. He always let it get to empty, because he assumed he could just fill it up without thinking. I saw the transaction attempt. Attempted charge. $98 premium fuel. Status, declined. Derek was standing at the pump, the cold wind whipping his expensive coat. The nozzle wouldn't dispense. The screen would flash that hateful message, "See cashier." He would have to walk inside. He would have to stand in line behind people buying lottery tickets and cigarettes. He would have to face the clerk, a tired kid making minimum wage, and explain that his card wasn't working. He would try another card. The Visa, declined. The MasterCard, declined. I had frozen them all. I closed my eyes and pictured my son, a man who prided himself on his image. He drove a Porsche. He wore Italian suits. He acted like he owned the city. And now he was patting down his pockets, searching for loose cash, like a desperate man. He would find maybe a 20 in his wallet. Maybe some 5s in the glove box. He would have to count out crumpled bills on the counter, while the people behind him sighed and checked their watches. He would have to go back out to his $100,000 car and pump $23 worth of gas. Just enough to get home. Just enough to run away. My phone on the table began to buzz. It was Derek. I let it ring. It stopped. Then it started again immediately. Second call. Third call. Fourth. I watched the screen light up with his name over and over. My son. The boy I'd carried on my shoulders. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike. The man who told me I was a ghost. He was calling the ghost now. He was begging the ghost to answer. By the 10th call, I felt a twinge of that old instinct. The instinct to protect. The instinct to pick up the phone and say, "It's okay, son. I'll fix it. I'll transfer the money. Just go home." It was muscle memory, built over 40 years of motherhood. But then I remembered his voice at the table. If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would miss you. I poured another glass of wine. I let the phone ring. 15 calls. 20 calls. He was panicking now. He was realizing that this wasn't a technical glitch. This was a siege. I looked out the window at the skyline. I thought about the job Derek had, director of sales. He loved that title. He had it printed on heavy business cards with gold embossing. He loved telling people at parties what he did. He loved the respect it garnered. He never stopped to ask why he had that job. He never wondered why a mid-sized logistics company would hire a man with a mediocre degree and no proven track record for such a senior position. He never questioned why his salary was double the industry average. Educational anchor 2, cognitive dissonance and the illusion of success. Derek's entire professional life was built on a foundation of cognitive dissonance. He genuinely believed his success was self-made, that his inflated salary and corner office were due to his own merit, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. People engage in this kind of self-deception to protect their ego and maintain a consistent, positive self-image. It's a powerful psychological mechanism that allows individuals to ignore uncomfortable truths and construct elaborate internal narratives that justify their privileges. Maggie, by providing a nursery within a corporation. inadvertently fostered this delusion, making it nearly impossible for Derek to distinguish between genuine achievement and orchestrated patronage. He didn't know that I was the majority shareholder. He didn't know that I'd set up a silent partnership with the CEO 15 years ago, specifically to create a landing spot for him. I had built a nursery for him inside a corporation. His salary wasn't payment for his labor. It was an allowance. It was my dividends funneled through a payroll department so he could feel like a big man. He'd never closed a major deal in his life. The clients he managed were my old contacts, people who did business with him as a favor to me. He went to meetings. He bought lunch. He played golf. And he thought that was work. He thought that was success. He was playing house in a mansion I bought, driving a car I leased, working a job I created. He was a paper doll living in a paper world, and I had just struck a match. 30 calls. The phone finally stopped buzzing. The silence in the hotel room was heavy, but it was clean. It was the silence of truth. I picked up the iPad again. I opened the banking portal. I had one more surprise for him today. A little reality check to end his afternoon. The joint checking account he shared with Vanessa was set up with substantial overdraft protection. I had backed it personally for years. Whenever they spent more than they had, which was every single month, the bank would automatically cover it, drawing from my line of credit. They never even noticed. They just swiped and swiped, assuming the well was bottomless. This morning, I had removed the protection. And then I had instructed the bank to call the note. I tapped the screen and sent the notification. Somewhere in that Porsche, driving home on $23 of gas, Derek's phone would ping. He would pull it out, expecting a text from me. Expecting an apology. Expecting a rescue. Instead, he would see an email from the bank. Subject: immediate action required. Account overdrawn. He would open it. He would see the red numbers. They had spent $80,000 more than was in the account this month alone. The renovation on the guest bathroom. The deposit for the vacation in Aspen. The new furniture for the patio. The email would be polite but firm. You are overdrawn by $80,400. Please remit payment within 24 hours to avoid further action and potential legal consequences. $80,000. He didn't have $80,000. He didn't have $80. I took another sip of wine. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the frozen lake. The game had officially begun. He had wanted me to disappear. I had granted his wish. But he forgot that when the sun disappears, it gets very cold and very dark. I watched the security feed on the iPad. The Porsche pulled into the driveway. Derek got out. He slammed the car door. He looked disheveled. He looked terrified. He walked to the front door and fumbled with his keys. He didn't know it yet, but those keys were about to become useless too. I watched him enter the house that he thought was his. I watched him turn on the lights that he thought he paid for. I raised my glass to the screen. Welcome to the real world, son. I hope you survive it. Monday morning arrived with the brutal gray light of a Chicago winter. From my vantage point in the penthouse suite, I watched the city below wake up. The streets were gridlocked with people rushing to jobs they hated, to pay for lives they could barely afford. I drank my coffee black and turned my attention to the iPad propped on the table. I had switched the feed from my home security system to a private server link I'd established years ago with the building management of J&L Logistics, the company where Derek worked. Or rather, where Derek used to work. I was not just watching my son. I was watching the demolition of a fantasy. Derek pulled his Porsche into the executive parking lot at 8:45 a.m. He was late. He was always late. He believed that punctuality was for subordinates, and that his presence was a gift that started the workday whenever he arrived. I could see the stress in his posture, even from the grainy camera angle. He was wearing his favorite navy suit, the one that cost $3,000, but he looked disheveled. He was a man running on fumes, quite literally, given that he'd pumped $23 of gas the day before. He walked into the lobby with that familiar swagger, the one he used to mask his insecurities. He approached the turnstiles and pulled out his security badge. He tapped it against the reader with a casual flick of the wrist, expecting the satisfying beep and green light that had welcomed him for 15 years. Buzz. Red light. Access denied. He frowned. He tapped it again, harder this time. Buzz. Access denied. I saw him look around, annoyed. He probably thought it was a system error. A glitch in the matrix of his perfect life. He walked over to the security desk. The guard on duty was a man named Sam. I'd hired Sam myself 10 years ago when he was down on his luck. Sam was loyal to the building, and he knew exactly who signed the real checks. I watched Derek gesture at the turnstile. I couldn't hear the audio, but I could read his body language. He was demanding to be let in. He was pointing at his chest, using the "Do you know who I am" card. Sam didn't flinch. He didn't press the override button. Instead, he reached under the desk and pulled out a medium-sized cardboard box. The box. The universal symbol of corporate death. Derek stared at it. He took a step back, as if the box were a bomb. He was shouting now. His face was turning that blotchy red color he'd inherited from his father's side of the family. He was making a scene in the lobby of a company where he thought he was a prince. Then the elevator doors opened and Judith walked out. Judith was the HR director, a woman of steel who'd survived 3 mergers and a hostile takeover. She was also one of the few people who knew the truth about Derek's employment. I zoomed in on the camera feed. Judith walked straight up to him. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't smile. She held a manila envelope in one hand and pointed to the box with the other. Derek was waving his arms. I could imagine the words spewing from his mouth. I'm the director of sales. I'm a top performer. My numbers are incredible. You can't do this. My mother will sue this entire building into the ground. Judith waited for him to run out of breath. She was patient. Then she handed him the envelope. He ripped it open. He scanned the paper. His hand started to shake. The document he was reading was a simple disclosure of equity structure. For 15 years, Derek believed he was hired because he was a genius. He believed his $250,000 salary was a reflection of his market value. He believed the company car, the expense account, and the corner office were rewards for his talent. He was wrong. I owned 40% of the preferred shares of J&L Logistics. I'd bought them quietly, through a shell company, a decade and a half ago, specifically to ensure my son had a place to land after he'd failed out of 2 other startups. His salary was not an operating expense for the company. It was a dividend payout. Every 2 weeks, the company took the money I was owed as a shareholder and routed it into his paycheck. I had been paying him to play businessman. Derek looked up from the paper. He looked at Judith. He looked at the box. Judith said something. I knew exactly what the script was because I'd written it for her the night before. She told him that the shares had been sold. This morning, at 9 a.m., the transfer was finalized. I had liquidated my position. And the new majority owners, a private equity firm from New York, were ruthless cost-cutters. They had audited the staff and found a director of sales who spent 4 days a week at the golf course and whose client list consisted entirely of his mother's old friends. They didn't need a mascot. They needed a manager. Derek dropped the paper. It fluttered to the marble floor like a wounded bird. He looked around the lobby. The receptionists were looking down at their desks. The security guard was staring straight ahead. The people passing through the turnstiles, the real workers, were glancing at him with a mix of pity and indifference. He was realizing that he was naked. He had no job, no income, no health insurance, no status. The Porsche outside was a company lease, and without his employment status, the repo order would be issued within 48 hours. He grabbed the box. He didn't pack his office. Judith had done it for him. A stapler, a photo frame, a coffee mug that said "World's Best Boss," which he'd bought for himself. That was the sum total of his career. He turned and walked out of the building. The swagger was gone. He walked like an old man, like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But it wasn't the world. It was just the truth. And the truth is heavy when you've never carried it before. I switched the feed back to the GPS tracker on the Porsche. He was sitting in the parking lot. He sat there for 20 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel. He was probably trying to process the impossible. He was probably waiting for his phone to ring, waiting for me to call and say it was all a cruel joke, a test that he'd passed just by enduring it. But my phone lay silent on the table next to my cold coffee. I was not calling. Finally, the engine started. He pulled out of the lot, recklessly, cutting off a delivery truck. He was driving fast, too fast. He was heading north, back toward Lake Forest. I watched the dot move across the map, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. He was in survival mode. He needed cash. He needed a lifeline. He couldn't go to Vanessa with empty hands. She was probably still screaming about her cut-up credit card. He needed to bring home a victory, something to prove he was still the provider, still the man. He was heading home to rob me. I knew my son better than he knew himself. He wasn't creative. When cornered, he reverted to the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance led directly to my wine cellar. I had been collecting wine for 30 years. The climate-controlled room in the basement of the Lake Forest house held bottles worth more than some cars. There were cases of Petrus, verticals of Screaming Eagle, bottles of Romani Conti that I'd bought at auction in the 90s. It was my pride and joy, a collection built not for investment, but for the sheer pleasure of preservation. Derek knew the codes. He knew the value. He bragged about the cellar to his friends, acting as if he'd curated it himself. He was doing the math in his head right now as he wove through traffic on the expressway. If he could sell just 5 or 6 bottles, he could get $20, maybe $30,000 cash from a fence or a shady collector. It would cover the overdraft. It would pay the minimums. It would buy him another month of illusion. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was solving the problem. He didn't know that the wine cellar was a trap. I picked up the hotel phone and dialed the front desk. I asked for a fresh pot of coffee. I had a long afternoon ahead of me. On the screen, the Porsche was tearing up the Shoreline Drive. He was 20 minutes away. I switched the camera feed to the basement. The camera was hidden in the smoke detector housing, giving me a perfect view of the heavy oak door and the rows of racks inside. The cellar was dark and cool. The humidifier hummed softly in the corner. It was a sanctuary. In 20 minutes, a desperate man with a cardboard box full of office supplies was going to break into that sanctuary. He was going to try to liquidate my memories to pay for his. I wondered if he would hesitate. I wondered if he would feel a pang of guilt as he reached for the bottles I'd saved for special occasions, for his wedding, for the birth of his child. But as I watched the dot on the map draw closer, I realized I already knew the answer. Guilt requires a conscience, and desperation eats conscience for breakfast. He pulled into the driveway. He didn't park in the garage. He parked right by the front door, leaving the engine running. He ran inside, leaving the front door wide open, letting the winter air rush into the house. He was frantic. He threw his suit jacket on the floor. He ran past the kitchen, past the living room, and threw open the door to the basement stairs. I switched cameras, tracking his descent. He stumbled down the stairs, his tie loose, his hair wild. He looked like a man possessed. He reached the cellar door and punched in the code. Beep 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 click. The door unlocked. I hadn't changed that code. I wanted him to get in. I wanted him to feel the victory of access before the crushing weight of reality. He rushed in. He went straight for the back section, the French section where the most expensive bottles lived. He grabbed a crate. He started pulling bottles off the rack, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped a 1982 Leoville Las Cases. He was muttering to himself. I could hear it on the audio feed. Just a few. Just a few. She won't notice. She never comes down here. She won't notice. He was wrong. I noticed everything. He loaded 6 bottles into the crate. He looked at them, calculating their worth in his head. He smiled, a manic, terrified smile. He thought he had won. He thought he'd found the loophole. He turned to leave, the crate clutched to his chest like a baby. He didn't know that the moment he stepped out of that cellar with my property, he was crossing a line from ungrateful son to common criminal. He was sealing his fate, and he was walking right into the next phase of his education. Because the wine was just the beginning. The real hangover was yet to come. Derek stumbled out the front door, the crate of wine rattling in his arms like loose teeth. He froze. The driveway was no longer empty. It looked like a presidential motorcade had parked on his lawn. 2 black SUVs blocked the exit, their engines idling with a low, menacing rumble. Standing between them was a wall of a man I knew very well, Tony Rodriguez. Tony was the head of a private security firm I'd used for high-risk construction sites back in the 90s. He had a neck as thick as a tree trunk and a face that didn't know how to smile. Derek clutched the wine crate tighter. He looked like a deer caught in headlights that were attached to a freight train. Just then, Vanessa's Range Rover screeched into the driveway behind the SUVs. She leaned on the horn, her frustration from the rejected credit cards boiling over into road rage. She jumped out of the car, slamming the door so hard the vehicle rocked. "What is going on?" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the cold air like a knife. "Why is the gate code not working? Why are these cars here? Derek, tell them to move." Derek didn't answer. He was staring at Tony. Tony took 1 step forward and extended his hand. His voice was calm, deep, and terrifying. "That's stolen property, Mr. Thornton. Hand it over." Derek looked at the crate, then at Tony. He did the math. The math said he was outmatched by about 100 pounds of muscle and a lifetime of bad decisions. He handed the crate over. Tony passed it to one of his men, who carefully placed it in the back of an SUV. $20,000 of wine, gone in 10 seconds. Vanessa marched up the steps, her heels clicking aggressively on the stone. She tried to push past Derek to get into the house. She grabbed the handle of the front door. Locked. She punched in the code on the smart lock. The keypad flashed red. Denied. She tried again, frantic. "Open the door, Derek. Open the goddamn door." Derek looked at her, his face pale as snow. "I can't," he whispered. "I think she changed the codes." Before Vanessa could scream again, the rear door of the second SUV opened. Catherine Sterling stepped out. She was wrapped in a long cashmere coat, holding a leather portfolio. She looked like an executioner dressed by Prada. She walked up the driveway with the grace of a woman who knows she holds all the cards. She stopped 5 feet from my son and daughter-in-law. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply extended a thick envelope toward Derek. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Thornton, you've been served." Derek stared at the envelope like it was a snake. "What is this?" "It's an emergency order of eviction," Catherine said, her breath misting in the air. "Effective immediately." Vanessa laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that echoed off the stone facade. "Eviction? You can't evict us. We own this house. My husband owns this house." Catherine allowed herself a small, pitying smile. "That's a common misconception, Mrs. Thornton. If you had ever bothered to read the deed or the trust documents you signed 3 years ago, you would know that is factually incorrect." She opened a folder and held up a document, the paper fluttering slightly in the wind. "This property is the sole asset of the Thornton Family Trust," Catherine explained, speaking slowly, as if talking to children. "Margaret Thornton is the sole trustee and grantor. You are listed merely as beneficiaries with right of residency." She turned the page. However, Clause 7b of the trust agreement clearly states that the right of residency is contingent upon the beneficiaries maintaining a relationship of respect and gratitude toward the grantor. It's what we call a morality clause. Catherine's voice was relentless, like water wearing down stone. Specifically, it states that any act of verbal abuse, financial exploitation, or public disparagement of the grantor results in immediate termination of benefits. Derek looked like he was going to be sick. He remembered the dinner. He remembered what he'd said. "If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would miss you." "Your comments at the Thanksgiving dinner were recorded and witnessed," Catherine continued, flipping through pages with practiced efficiency. They constitute a material breach of Clause 7b. As of 12 o'clock today, the trust has revoked your right of residency. You are trespassing. This is insane. Derek stammered, finally finding his voice. She's my mother. She can't kick me out of my own home over an argument. She can. And she has, Catherine said, closing the folder with a snap. You have exactly 2 hours. 2 hours for what? Vanessa asked, her voice trembling now, the reality beginning to crack through her anger. To remove your personal effects, Catherine said, checking her watch. Tony and his team will supervise. You may take clothing, toiletries, and personal documents. Nothing else. Vanessa's eyes widened. She looked at the house, then back at Catherine. What about my things? My furniture? My art? My bags? Educational Anchor 3, Social Currency and Material Identity. Vanessa's reaction highlights a crucial social dynamic: the construction of identity through material possessions. For many, especially within cultures that emphasize outward displays of wealth and status, think influencer culture, one's sense of self-worth and belonging is inextricably linked to what they own and the perception it creates. The humiliation Vanessa experiences isn't just about losing things, it's about the public unraveling of her carefully curated persona, her brand. The social currency she relied on, built on borrowed assets, is completely devalued, leaving her emotionally bankrupt. Catherine looked at her with eyes like flint. Let's be clear, Mrs. Thornton. The trust paid for the furniture. The trust paid for the art. The trust paid for the renovations. Therefore, they are assets of the trust. She paused, letting that sink in. As for your bags, I have a forensic accounting of the credit card statements. Every handbag purchased with the supplemental card provided by Mrs. Thornton remains the property of the account holder. That is Mrs. Thornton. You may take what you paid for with your own personal income. Vanessa stood there, mouth agape. She had no personal income. She hadn't worked a day in the 5 years she'd been married to my son. She realized with horror that almost everything she touched, everything she wore, everything she bragged about online, belonged to the woman she had just insulted. You can't do this, she screamed, lunging toward the door. I'm not leaving without my Birkins. Tony stepped in front of the door. He didn't touch her. He just occupied the space. He was an immovable object. You have 1 hour and 55 minutes, ma'am, Tony said. I suggest you start packing. We have boxes for you. He gestured to the driveway where his men were unloading a stack of cheap, clear plastic bins, the kind you use to store Christmas decorations in a damp garage. I watched on the iPad as the reality crashed down on them like an avalanche. They weren't fighting for their dignity anymore. They were fighting for their underwear. They went inside. Tony followed them, clipboard in hand. I switched the camera feed to the interior. It was a chaotic ballet of desperation. Derek ran to the master bedroom. He grabbed a suitcase and started throwing suits into it, not bothering to fold them. Tony stood in the doorway, impassive. Leave the watches, Tony said as Derek reached for his watch box. What? Derek spun around. Those were gifts purchased with company funds. Trust property. Leave them, Tony read from the list Catherine had provided. Derek slammed the box down. He grabbed his shoes from the closet. Not the Ferragamos, Tony said, consulting the list. Receipt dated June 12th, paid by Margaret Thornton. Leave them. I watched my son realize that he didn't even own the shoes on his feet. He had to dig into the back of the closet to find a pair of old running sneakers he'd bought himself years ago. He looked ridiculous in his suit pants and dirty sneakers. In the dressing room, Vanessa was having a complete meltdown. She was trying to stuff a fur coat into a plastic bin. Catherine appeared in the doorway. The coat stays. Vanessa screamed. She actually screamed, a primal sound of loss that probably frightened the neighbors. She threw the coat on the floor and stomped on it, like a child having a tantrum. If I can't have it, nobody can. That will be deducted from any potential future settlement, Catherine noted calmly, making a mark on her tablet. Keep packing. The 2 hours flew by. I sat in my hotel room, finishing a pot of coffee, feeling a satisfaction that was colder than happiness. I was stripping them down to nothing. I was peeling away the layers of entitlement like dead skin. At the 1 hour and 50-minute mark, Tony began moving the bins outside. There weren't many. A few bins of clothes, some toiletries, a laptop that Derek managed to prove he bought with a bonus check from 3 years ago, back when he still occasionally got real bonuses from real work. The house looked strangely undisturbed. They had lived there for 3 years, but without their clutter, without their noise. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. It was returning to me. Outside, the winter sun was beginning to set. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pristine snow. I saw movement on the sidewalk. The neighbors. Lake Forest is a small community. Gossip travels faster than light. The sight of black SUVs and security guards had drawn attention. Mrs. Gable from next door was walking her poodle, walking very slowly, her eyes glued to the driveway like it was a television show. Mr. Henderson across the street was pretending to check his mailbox, though the mail had been delivered hours ago. They were watching. Derek emerged first, dragging 2 plastic bins. He looked broken. His hair was messy. His tie was gone. He was shivering in his dress shirt because his expensive overcoat had been deemed trust property. Vanessa followed. She was carrying a plastic bin filled with cosmetics and cheap sweatpants. She was wearing a puffer jacket she'd found in the mudroom, one of the few things she'd actually bought on sale. She was crying, mascara running down her face in black rivers. They stood on the driveway of the mansion they used to rule, surrounded by clear plastic bins that displayed their meager possessions to the world, like items at a yard sale. Catherine stood by the gate, holding her clipboard. "Sign here," she said, pointing to a document. "What is it?" Derek asked, his voice hollow. "Acknowledgement of vacating the premises and receipt of personal property. It also confirms that you've surrendered all keys and access codes." Derek signed. He didn't even read it. He just wanted it to be over. "Where are we supposed to go?" Vanessa sobbed, her voice breaking. "Our cards don't work. We have no gas. We have nowhere to go." Catherine looked at them. For a second, I thought she might offer them a hotel voucher. I'd given her discretion to do so if she felt it was necessary for humanitarian reasons. But Catherine was a professional. She knew that rock bottom has to be solid before you can build on it. "There's a Motel 6 off the interstate," she said, her voice neutral. "They accept cash. I believe Mr. Thornton has about $40 in his wallet. That should cover a night." She turned and walked to her car. Tony and his team fell back, forming a line across the driveway like sentinels. Derek and Vanessa looked at the Range Rover. They knew they couldn't take it. It was leased by the company Derek no longer worked for. They looked at the Porsche, also company property. They had to call an Uber, but their apps were linked to the frozen cards. I watched as Derek pulled out his phone and made a call. He was calling a taxi. An old-fashioned yellow cab. They waited on the curb for 20 minutes in the freezing cold, sitting on their plastic bins like refugees. The neighbors watched. The security guards watched. I watched. When the taxi finally arrived, the driver popped the trunk. Derek had to load the bins himself. He struggled with the weight, slipping on the icy pavement. Vanessa got in the back seat without helping him. She slammed the door. Derek finished loading the trunk. He stood there for a moment, looking up at the house. He looked at the window of the master bedroom where he'd slept comfortably for years. He looked at the warm lights spilling out onto the snow. He looked like a child who'd been kicked out of Eden. He got into the taxi. It drove away, its taillights disappearing into the gloom of early evening. I put down the iPad. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. I picked up the room service menu. I decided to order the lobster bisque. They were gone. The house was mine. The money was mine. But the lesson was far from over. The next morning, I returned to the house. Tony met me at the front door. The air inside was cold. They'd left the door open when Derek ran down to the wine cellar, and it had taken hours for the heating system to compensate. Everything secure? I asked. Yes, ma'am, Tony said. But there's something you need to see in the basement. We walked through the silent house. Without Derek and Vanessa's presence, it felt larger, somehow cleaner, like a body that had fought off an infection. We descended the stairs to the basement. Tony led me past the wine cellar. The bottles Derek had tried to steal were back in their places, perfectly aligned. He walked to the back wall where a heavy oak shelving unit used to hold cases of Bordeaux. The unit had been pulled away from the wall, scraping deep gouges into the concrete floor. Behind it was a wall safe. It wasn't a safe I had installed. I knew every inch of this house. I had reviewed the blueprints myself. I had supervised the contractors. This safe was a retrofit job, installed hastily and without permits. The plaster around the edges was rough and unpainted. It was a secret pocket in a house that was supposed to be transparent. It was open, Tony said. The lock had been drilled out. I opened it yesterday while securing the premises. He handed me a stack of documents. They were kept in a blue plastic folder, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $1. I took them, my hand steady, despite the chill running down my spine. I walked over to the workbench in the corner and turned on the overhead light. I began to read, and with every page, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. These weren't bank statements. These were promissory notes. But they weren't from Chase or Wells Fargo. They were from entities with names like North Star Holdings and Veriv Capital. I knew these names. In the construction business in Chicago, you hear things. You know which names appear on legitimate contracts and which names appear in police reports. These were loan shark operations, thinly veiled as private equity. I looked at the numbers. They were staggering. $50,000. $100,000. $200,000. The dates went back 18 months. It started small, probably gambling debts or lifestyle maintenance when the allowance from me wasn't enough. But then the amount spiked. I saw notes referencing margin calls on cryptocurrency platforms. Derek had bought into the hype. He bet the farm on digital coins that had crashed and burned. And when he lost, he didn't stop. He doubled down. He borrowed to cover the losses. Then he borrowed to cover the interest. The total principal amount was $512,000. $500,000. My son had blown $500,000 on invisible money and bad bets. But that wasn't the part that made my blood run cold. The part that stopped my heart was the collateral section on the final, largest loan document. Collateral property located at 1422 Lakeshore Drive, Lake Forest, Illinois. My house. The house held in my trust. I flipped to the signature page. There it was. Margaret Thornton. It was my name, but it wasn't my hand. The slant was wrong. The loop on the T was too tight. It was a forgery. A good one, but a forgery nonetheless. Derek had signed my name. He had posed as me, or claimed he had power of attorney. He had convinced these criminals that he had the authority to leverage the property. He had handed them the deed to a house he didn't own, to secure cash that he immediately lost. I looked at the date on the final loan. It was dated 3 weeks ago. That was why he was so desperate at Thanksgiving. That was why he exploded when I cut him off. He wasn't just worried about paying for dinner. He wasn't just worried about Vanessa's shopping sprees. He was worried about making the VIG, the weekly interest payment that kept his kneecaps intact. He was drowning. And in his panic, he had decided to use me as his life raft. Without my permission. Without my knowledge. This changes everything, Tony said quietly, reading my expression. I nodded slowly. It was worse than theft. It was worse than entitlement. He had involved organized crime. These people don't sue you when you default. They don't send collection letters. They send messages. And since Derek was currently hiding in a motel room with his phone likely turned off or changed, those messages were going to be delivered to the address on the contract. My address. I gathered the papers and put them back in the folder. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching myself from outside my body. My son had sold me out. He had placed a target on my back to save his own skin. He figured that if the sharks came for the house, I would just pay them off to avoid the scandal. He banked on my pride being stronger than my principles. He was wrong. "Let's go, Tony," I said. "We're done here." We drove back to the city. I was in my F-150, Tony following in the armored SUV. The winter sky was dark and heavy with the threat of more snow. I kept checking my rearview mirror. I wasn't just looking for traffic. I was looking for tails. I drove to the Ritz-Carlton. I pulled up to the valet stand. The hotel was a fortress of luxury, a place where the problems of the street were supposed to be kept at bay by doormen in uniforms and thick glass doors. I got out of the truck. I handed the keys to the valet, a young man named Eric who always treated the old Ford with respect. "Mrs. Thornton, good to see you," Eric said, smiling. Before I could answer, a black sedan screeched around the corner. It didn't slow down. It sped past the entrance, dangerously close to the valet stand. The rear window rolled down. I saw a flash of movement, an arm extending. "Watch out," I shouted, shoving Eric to the side. A stream of thick red liquid erupted from the car. It splashed across the side of my white truck, covering the door and fender in a violent crimson arc. It splattered onto the pavement, looking for all the world like a crime scene. Paint. It was red, oil-based paint. The sedan peeled away, tires squealing, disappearing into Chicago traffic before security could even react. Eric was on the ground, shaking. I helped him up. He was unhurt, but terrified. I looked at my truck. The red paint dripped slowly down the metal, pooling on the concrete. It was a mark. A brand. It was a message that said, "We know where you are." Tony was by my side in seconds, his hand hovering near the gun beneath his jacket. "Get inside, Mrs. Thornton. Now." We went into the lobby. The hotel manager was already rushing over, apologetic and horrified. I waved him off. "It's fine. Just get the truck cleaned and bill me for the cleanup of the driveway." I went up to the penthouse. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. They had found me. They knew I wasn't at the house. That meant they were watching. I entered the suite. Tony did a sweep of the room, checking the windows. "Clear," he said. "But ma'am, we need to move you. This location is compromised." "No," I said. "I'm not running. That's what Derek does. I stay." I walked to the window to close the heavy drapes. As I reached for the cord, a dark shape blurred through the air outside. Crash. The double-paned glass of the balcony door shattered. A heavy object smashed through the outer pane, then the inner pane, sending a shower of safety glass raining onto the Persian rug. The cold wind rushed in instantly, howling through the breach. Tony tackled me to the ground, covering my body with his. We lay there for a moment among the shards, waiting for a second shot or an explosion. Nothing happened, just the wind. "Clear," Tony yelled into his radio. "Breach in the penthouse." He helped me up. I brushed the glass from my robe. I walked over to the object that had broken the window. It was a brick. A standard red construction brick, wrapped in duct tape. There was a piece of paper taped to it. I picked it up. The note was short, written in black marker, block letters. "Pay or bleed." The son signed, but the mother pays. 24 hours. I stared at the note. Most 73-year-old women would be having a heart attack right now. Most would be dialing 911, begging for police protection, weeping into the phone. But as I looked at the crude threat, a strange sensation washed over me. The corner of my mouth twitched, then it curled upward. I was smiling. Tony looked at me concerned. "Mrs. Thornton, are you all right? Do you want me to call the precinct? This is a death threat." "No, Tony," I said, my voice surprisingly light. "Don't call the police." "Why not, ma'am? This is serious." "Because this," I held up the brick, "is not a threat, Tony. This is leverage." I walked over to the desk, avoiding the glass. I placed the brick next to the folder of loan documents we'd found in the basement. "Derek thinks he's hiding. He thinks he can wait this out in a motel, while I deal with the mess he created. He thinks these animals will scare me into paying his debt, just to make them go away. He thinks I'll write a check for $500,000 to save the family name. I turned to look at Tony. But Derek forgot who raised him. He forgot that before I wore suits, I wore work boots. He forgot that I dealt with unions and mobsters in the 70s, when Chicago was a very different city. I picked up the loan documents again. He's handed me a loaded gun, thinking I would shoot myself. But he put the handle in my hand. Tony was listening carefully now. These criminals, they don't care about Derek. They want their money. And right now, they think I'm the obstacle. But what if I became the solution? What if instead of being the victim, I became the boss? I looked at the documents again. The forgery was the key. It proved Derek had defrauded them too. It proved the collateral was worthless. If they killed me, they got nothing. The trust would lock down, and the house would be tied up in probate for years. They would never see a dime. But if I made a deal. I turned to Tony. Get the car ready. Not the truck, the armored sedan. Where are we going, ma'am? Tony asked. We're going to make a phone call, I said. I want you to find the number for this Veriv Capital. We're going to set up a meeting with the loan sharks. Because Tony, I'm going to buy my son's debt. I'm going to become the owner of that note. And when I do, I will own him, body and soul. I looked at the shattered window, the wind blowing the curtains wildly. Derek wanted to play gangster. He wanted to play with the big boys. Well, he was about to find out that the biggest gangster in this family had been sitting at the head of the table all along. Let them throw bricks. I was about to throw the whole building. Educational Anchor 4. The Psychology of Predatory Lending and Desperation. Derek's journey into the world of loan sharks highlights the vicious cycle of desperation, particularly for individuals accustomed to a certain lifestyle they can no longer afford. Predatory lenders, like Veriv Capital, thrive on this desperation. They offer quick cash with minimal questions, but at exorbitant interest rates and often with questionable collateral. The borrower, typically facing a margin call on their fabricated reality, in Derek's case, crypto losses and keeping up appearances, enters a state of panic, leading to poor judgment. They're so focused on immediate relief that they overlook the catastrophic long-term consequences, often resorting to fraud, as Derek did with the forged signature, believing they can always get out, or that a rescuer, like his mother, will inevitably step in. This creates an ever-tightening trap of debt and fear. The meeting with Veriv Capital didn't take place in a boardroom with glass walls and espresso machines. It happened in the back office of a dry cleaning distribution center in the industrial district south of the city. The air smelled of chemicals and hot steam. Tony drove the armored sedan right into the loading bay, where a steel door rattled shut behind us, sealing us in like a tomb. I stepped out of the car, buttoning my coat against the damp chill. I wasn't armed. I didn't need to be. Tony was behind me, and he was carrying enough firepower to start a small war. But my real weapon was inside my jacket pocket, a digital token for a secure wire transfer. We were escorted by two men who looked like they'd been carved out of granite. They led us into a small office, with flickering fluorescent lights. Behind a metal desk sat a man who didn't look like a monster. He looked like an accountant who had stopped sleeping. This was Vincent Veriv. He was thin, pale, and wore a suit that was expensive but ill-fitting, like he'd bought it off someone else's back. "Mrs. Thornton," he said without standing up. His voice was scratchy, like sandpaper. "You have bold friends. Usually when we throw a brick, people call the cops. You called for an appointment." I sat in the metal folding chair opposite him. I didn't lean back. I kept my posture rigid, like I was negotiating a construction contract. "I'm a businesswoman, Mr. Veriv," I said. "And I know a bad investment when I see one. You lent $500,000 to my son based on collateral he didn't own. That makes you a victim of fraud, just like me." Veriv smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We don't see ourselves as victims. We have ways of recovering our assets. The house is there. We will take it." "No, you won't," I replied, my voice level as ice. "The house is in a trust. The signature on your loan documents is a forgery. If you try to foreclose, my lawyers will tie you up in court for 10 years while exposing every illegal loan you've ever written. You'll never see a dime, and you might see the inside of a federal prison. Verev stopped smiling. He leaned forward, his fingers steepling on the desk. So why are you here? To threaten me? No, I said. I'm here to offer you an exit strategy. I placed my phone on the desk between us. Your loan to Derek is toxic debt. It's uncollectible. If you kill him, you get nothing. If you kill me, you get nothing. But right now, in this room, you have an opportunity to recover 70% of your principal. Immediate, liquid cash. No police, no courts, no questions. Verev looked at the phone, then at me. His eyes were calculating, measuring risk against reward. 70%. That's a haircut. It's better than zero, I said. And it's better than a federal investigation. I'll wire you $350,000 right now. In exchange, you transfer the note to me. You give me the original contract, the wet signature, everything. You wash your hands of Derek Thornton. He becomes my problem. The silence in the room was heavy, interrupted only by the hissing of the steam presses outside. Verev was doing the math. He was a predator, but he was a pragmatic one. He knew I was right. Derek was a deadbeat with no assets and a mother who had just frozen him out. $350,000, Verev repeated slowly. CD wire transfer, immediate, untraceable through the proper channels. Verev drummed his fingers on the desk. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then he nodded. Done. The transaction took 3 minutes. I authorized the transfer on my phone. Verev checked his laptop, watching the numbers appear in his offshore account. When he nodded, one of his guards opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick envelope. He slid it across the desk, like we were closing a real estate deal. He's all yours, Verev said. He's a bad gambler, Mrs. Thornton. He chases losses. You should know that. I took the envelope. I didn't check the contents there. I knew Verev wouldn't cheat me on the paperwork. His reputation depended on closing deals cleanly. Pleasure doing business, I said, standing up. We walked out of the warehouse into the winter gray. I sat in the back of the car, clutching the envelope like it was the Holy Grail. I opened it. Inside was the promissory note, the evidence of my son's crimes. The forged signature stared up at me, a jagged imitation of my own name. I was no longer just Derek's mother. I was the holder of his debt. I owned the paper that could send him to prison for 20 years. I had just bought his life for $350,000. Drive, Tony, I said. Where to, ma'am? Into the courthouse. We need to file a lien against any future earnings he might have. And Tony, find out which motel room they're in. I want to pay them a visit. But before we could even reach the highway, my phone rang. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize. I answered it. Hello, Mom. It was Derek. His voice was different. It wasn't the arrogant tone from Thanksgiving. It wasn't the panicked tone from the eviction. It was manic. It was the sound of a man who had snapped. Derek, I said calmly, keeping my voice steady. I have some news for you. I just had a meeting with your friends at Verev Capital. I know, he interrupted me, his voice high and fast. I know you bought the debt. They texted me. They said I owe you now. Congratulations, Mom. You think you won. You think you have me in a corner. I don't think, Derek, I know. You committed forgery. I hold the note. Surrender yourself and we can discuss terms. Terms. Derek laughed, a jagged, broken sound like glass shattering. No more terms. You took my house. You took my job. You took my car. You embarrassed me in front of the whole city. You want to play hardball? Fine. Let's play. Something in his voice made my blood run cold. Derek, stop this. Where are you? I'm not at the motel anymore, Mom. And I'm not alone. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. My hand gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. What do you mean? Ask your grandson. The blood drained from my face. My vision tunneled. Everything in the car seemed to tilt sideways. Oliver. My 10-year-old grandson. The only innocent thing in this entire rotten equation. Put him on the phone, Derek. Now. There was a rustling sound, then a small, terrified voice. Grandma. The sound of Oliver's voice hit me harder than the brick through the window. It was like a knife twisting in my gut. Ollie, are you okay? Where are you? I don't know, Grandma. His voice was shaking. Daddy picked me up from school early. He said we were going on an adventure, but he's driving really fast and he's yelling at the phone. I want to go home. Listen to me, Ollie. Everything is going to be okay. Grandma is going to fix it. Just be brave. Okay. He was crying now. But Grandma, Daddy says you're the bad guy. He says you stole our house. He says you want to hurt us. Why are you doing this, Grandma? The pain was physical. A sharp, twisting agony in my chest. My son was using my grandson as a human shield. He was poisoning the boy's mind, turning his love into a weapon. Ollie, I love you. Don't believe that. I love you more than anything. Give the phone back to your father. Derek snatched it back. You hear that, Mom? He's scared of you. And he should be, because you're the reason we're running. What do you want, Derek? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. I want my life back. But since I can't have that, I want a settlement. A real one, not your charity. I want $1 million cash, transferred to an offshore account I'll provide. You're kidnapping your own son, Derek. This isn't a negotiation. This is a federal crime. It's a custodial dispute, Derek corrected. I'm his father. I have legal custody. I can take him wherever I want. But if you want to see him again, if you want to save him from a life on the run with a desperate man, you'll pay $1 million. Or what? Or we disappear for real this time. We go to Mexico. We go to South America. And while we're there, I'll tell him every day how his grandmother destroyed his family. I'll make sure he grows up hating the sound of your name. I'll raise him to be everything you despise. He hung up. I sat there in the armored car, the silence ringing in my ears. I felt old, older than 73. I felt ancient. Tony was watching me in the rearview mirror, his face pale. He'd heard enough to know it was bad. What's the play, ma'am? Do we call the FBI? Kidnapping across state lines. I raised a hand to stop him. If we call the FBI, they'll surround him. Derek is unstable. He's manic. If he sees blue lights, if he feels trapped, he might do something stupid. He might crash the car. He might hurt himself. He might hurt Oliver by accident. I couldn't risk that. Oliver was my blood. He was the future. Derek was a lost cause. But Oliver was salvageable. No police, I said. Not yet. I looked out the window. The city was passing by in a blur of gray and steel. I thought about the little boy who used to sit on my lap and ask me how cranes worked. I thought about the fishing trips, the ice cream cones, the bedtime stories. My son had taken the one thing I couldn't buy. He'd found the crack in the armor. He wanted $1 million. He thought that would solve his problems. He thought that would buy him freedom. He didn't understand that he had just signed his own death warrant. Not physically, I would never kill my son. But legally, morally, financially, I was going to erase him. But first, I had to get Oliver back. Turn the car around, Tony. Where to, ma'am? To the bank. The main branch. I need to make a withdrawal. You're going to pay him? No, Tony. I'm going to buy him out. I pulled out my phone again. I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. A private investigator. A man who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. A man who operated in the gray areas where the law hesitated to tread. Find him, I said when he answered. He has my grandson. Find him. Don't approach. Just give me the location. I hung up. Derek thought this was about money. He thought it was a transaction. He was wrong. This was a rescue mission. And when I found them, when I looked my son in the eye, he was going to realize that he'd made a mistake far worse than borrowing from loan sharks. He had threatened a mother's family. And for that, there is no forgiveness. There is only judgment. Finding a man who wants to stay hidden usually takes time, money, and mistakes. But finding a woman who is addicted to attention? That's remarkably easy, even when she's on the run. I sat in the back of the armored sedan, my phone glowing in the dim light. Beside me, Tony was coordinating with a team of private investigators I'd kept on retainer for 20 years. They were running license plate readers, checking credit databases, pinging cell towers. It was the old-fashioned way of hunting. It was slow, but I knew something about my daughter-in-law that the detectives didn't. Vanessa didn't exist in the real world. She existed in the cloud. Her self-worth was measured in likes, views, and the envy of strangers. Even now, hiding in a motel with a kidnapped child and a manic husband, she couldn't sever that lifeline. She needed to be seen. She needed to perform her victimhood. I pulled up my burner Instagram account, a blank profile I'd created months ago solely to monitor the spending habits she broadcast to the world. I navigated to the profile of a woman named Courtney. Courtney was Vanessa's best friend, her maid of honor, and her confidant. She was also a woman I had wired $10,000 to an hour ago. Courtney had no loyalty to Vanessa. Their friendship was a competitive sport based on who had the better handbag or the richer husband. When I called her and offered to buy her a new Cartier bracelet in exchange for access to Vanessa's close friends story list, she didn't hesitate. She screen recorded everything and sent it to me within minutes. I tapped the video file. It was a vertical video, shaky and poorly lit. Vanessa was whispering into the camera, her face washed out and tear-streaked. She was using a filter that smoothed her skin, even as she cried about being homeless. "Guys, please pray for us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're safe for now, but his mother is a monster. She took everything. We're hiding in this gross place, just trying to survive. We don't know what to do." Behind her, in the blurry background of the video, I saw a distinct pattern on the wallpaper. Faded yellow sailboats on a peeling blue background. It was specific. It was ugly. And it was identifiable. But it was the sound in the background that gave me the exact coordinates. Through the thin walls of the room, I could hear the distinct announcement of a train station PA system. "Next stop, Waukegan." I looked at Tony. "There. In Waukegan, near the metro station. Look for a motel with nautical wallpaper." Tony typed furiously into his laptop. 2 minutes later, he turned the screen toward me. "The Harbor Inn," he said. 1 star, 3 blocks from the station. Online reviews mentioned the smell of mildew and the sailboat wallpaper. Got them. We moved out. The drive to Waukegan took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of imagining my grandson in that room. 40 minutes of wondering if Derek had a gun. 40 minutes of preparing myself to make a deal with a woman who had sold her soul for likes. We parked the armored sedan a block away from the motel. It was a U-shaped building with paint peeling off the siding and a parking lot full of rusted cars. The air smelled of exhaust and desperation. I saw the stolen rental car Derek was driving parked askew in front of room 12. The curtains were drawn, but light leaked from the edges. Tony reached for the door handle. "We go in hard, ma'am," he said. "We kick the door, secure the child, subdue the father." "No," I said. "If we kick the door, Derek might panic. If he's holding Oliver, he might use him as a shield. Or worse, he might try to hurt me. This is where it gets really dark, you understand. We need to separate them. We need to open that door from the inside." I took out my phone again. I opened the file I'd been saving for a rainy day. Phase 2 of my investigation had turned up more than just financial crimes. Robert Sanchez, my private investigator, had followed Vanessa to the gym for weeks. He'd captured photos of her and her personal trainer, a man named Chad, who looked like he was carved out of protein powder and bad decisions. The photos were explicit. They were undeniable. They were taken in his car, in the parking lot of the gym, while Derek was at work, pretending to be a director. I composed a text message to Vanessa. I attached the 3 most compromising photos. Then I wrote the offer. "Hello, Vanessa. I know you're in room 12. I know about Chad. I know everything. Right now, you have 2 choices. Choice A. You stay in that room with a broke husband who's about to go to prison for kidnapping and fraud. When the police arrive, you'll be arrested as an accomplice. You'll go to jail with nothing. Choice B. You open the door right now. You send Oliver out to me. In exchange, I give you an envelope with $50,000 in cash. You walk away. You disappear. I never release these photos, and I never press charges against you. You have 2 minutes. I hit send. I watched the window of room 12. 1 minute passed. Nothing happened. The wind blew trash across the parking lot. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was she loyal? Was she afraid? Did she love her son more than money? 1 minute and 30 seconds. The curtain moved, just a sliver. And I peered out, scanning the parking lot. She was checking to see if the police were there. She saw only the dark shape of my sedan down the block. 1 minute and 45 seconds. My phone buzzed. Cash first. I typed back, Ollie first. 10 seconds later, the door cracked open. I signaled Tony. He stepped out of the car, moving silently into the shadows near the room. He held a thick manila envelope in one hand. The door opened wider. Vanessa stepped out. She was shivering, wearing a hoodie pulled low over her face. She looked around nervously. She didn't look back into the room. She didn't look worried about her husband. She pushed Oliver out the door. My grandson looked small. He was wearing his school uniform, rumpled and dirty. He was clutching a backpack. His eyes were wide and red from crying. Go, Ollie, Vanessa whispered, pushing him toward the parking lot. Go to the black car. Oliver hesitated. He looked at his mother. Mom, are you coming? Go, she hissed. Just go. Oliver ran. He ran toward my car, his little legs pumping against the cold pavement. Tony intercepted him halfway, shielding him with his body, guiding him to the back seat of the sedan. As soon as Oliver was safe inside the car, Tony turned back to Vanessa. He tossed the envelope. It landed at her feet. She scrambled for it, ripping it open, counting the stacks of $100 bills with shaking hands. She didn't look at her son. She didn't look at the room where her husband lay. She looked only at the money. She shoved the envelope into her hoodie, zipped it up and ran. She ran toward the train station, disappearing into the night without a backward glance. She had sold her family for $50,000, and she thought she got a good deal. I turned to Oliver. He was shaking in the back seat, his small body trembling with fear and cold. I pulled him into a hug. He smelled of motel soap and fear. Grandma, he sobbed, burying his face in my coat. I want to go home. You are going home, Ollie, I whispered, stroking his hair. You're safe now. Grandma has you. I looked up at Tony. Take him to the safe house, I said. Get him warm. Get him food. Call Catherine. Tell her we have the boy. What about you, ma'am? Tony asked. I looked at room 12. The door was still slightly ajar. I have one last piece of business. But ma'am, that's an order. Tony, go. Tony hesitated, then nodded. He got into the driver's seat and drove Oliver away, into the night, towards safety and warmth. I stood alone in the parking lot. I walked toward room 12. My footsteps were heavy on the asphalt, echoing in the cold silence. I pushed the door open. The room smelled of whiskey and despair. It was a small space, cluttered with fast food wrappers and empty bottles. The TV was unmuted, casting a blue, flickering light over the wreckage. Derek was lying on the bed. He was fully clothed, still wearing the suit he'd been fired in. He was passed out, face down, one arm hanging off the mattress, his fingers brushing the carpet. An empty bottle of cheap scotch lay on the floor beside him. He had drunk himself into oblivion to escape the reality of what he'd done. He had kidnapped his son, threatened his mother, and then passed out, leaving the door unlocked and his family unprotected. He was pathetic. I walked over to the bed. I looked down at him. This was my legacy. This was the man I had raised. A man who crumbled at the first sign of adversity. A man who needed a woman to sell him out to save him from himself. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt nothing. The cord was cut. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the document I had bought from Verev, the promissory note, the debt. I folded it neatly. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a small tube of superglue I'd bought at a gas station on the way over. I put a dab of glue on the back of the document. I leaned down. I brushed the hair off Derek's forehead. He groaned, but didn't wake. I pressed the paper onto his forehead, right in the center. It stuck. It was the notice of debt assignment, the legal document stating that Margaret Thornton was now the sole holder of his liabilities. I stepped back. He looked like a corpse tagged in a morgue. I took a piece of hotel stationery from the desk and a pen. I wrote a short note. Your wife took $50,000 to leave you. Your son is safe with me. The police know about the kidnapping, but I told them I recovered him. You're not being charged tonight because I don't want Oliver to see his father in handcuffs on the news. But this debt is real, and I will collect. You have nothing left, Derek. No wife, no son, no house, no job, and now no mother. I placed the note on the pillow next to his head. I looked around the room one last time. I saw his phone on the nightstand. I picked it up. I dropped it into the toilet bowl in the bathroom. He would wake up alone. He would wake up broke. He would wake up with a piece of paper glued to his face telling him that he was owned. I walked out of the room and closed the door. The latch clicked shut. I stood in the cold, waiting for Tony to return. The wind bit at my face, but I didn't feel it. I felt lighter. I had lost a son, but I had saved a grandson. And as I watched the neon sign of the motel flicker and buzz, I knew that the real work was just beginning. I had to raise Oliver. I had to undo the damage. I had to teach him what it meant to be a man, so he would never end up in a room like this, with a price tag on his head. The black SUV turned the corner, headlights cutting through the dark. I buttoned my coat. It was time to go home. 1 year later, the seasons had turned a full cycle. The summer in Lake Forest was green and vibrant, a stark contrast to the gray winter of our discontent. I was in the backyard, wearing a pair of old canvas pants and a t-shirt. I was kneeling in the dirt, holding a wooden slat in place. Next to me, Oliver was holding a hammer. He was 11 now, taller, stronger. His face had lost the pinch of anxiety that used to define him. He looked healthy. He looked happy. Okay, Ollie, I said. Drive it home. Straight and true. Oliver focused. He bit his lip in concentration. He swung the hammer. Bang. The nail went in straight. He swung again. Bang. Flushed with the wood. Good job, I said. That fence isn't going anywhere. Oliver beamed. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. Thanks, Grandma. It's hard work. It's good work, I corrected him. It's honest work. You build something with your hands and it stays built. Nobody can take that away from you. He nodded, understanding. We had spent the last year rebuilding. Not just the house, but his life. He went to a local school. He made friends who liked him for who he was, not what he owned. We cooked dinner together. We fixed things. We talked. He asked about his father sometimes. I told him the truth. I told him his father had gone away to learn how to work. I told him his father was sick with a disease called greed, and he needed a long time to get better. Oliver accepted that. He seemed relieved to be out of the chaos. We stood up and admired the fence. It was straight. It was strong. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I wiped my hands on my pants and pulled it out. It was a text message. The number was unfamiliar. The area code was from Alaska. I stared at the screen. My heart did a slow, heavy thud in my chest. I opened the message. There was a photo. A hand. A hand that was calloused, dirty, scarred with grease under the fingernails. A hand that looked like mine used to look 40 years ago. The hand was holding a stack of cash. $500 in 10s and 20s. Below the photo was a text. Payment one of 1,000 sent to your account via Western Union. This is the first money I ever earned with my hands. It took me 2 weeks of overtime on the rig. My back hurts. My hands bleed. I sleep in a container, but I sleep. I'm sending this not because I have to, but because I want to. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm starting. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. D. I looked at the screen. I looked at the dirty hand in the photo. It didn't look like the soft, manicured hand of the director of sales. It looked like a man's hand. I looked at Oliver, who was gathering the tools. Who is it, Grandma? Oliver asked, seeing me stare at the phone. I hesitated. I looked at the message again. $500. It was a drop in the ocean of $500,000, but it was the heaviest $500 I had ever seen. It was weight. It was substance. My son had survived the winter. He had survived the labor. He had not run. He had not begged. He had worked. It's just a friend, Ollie, I said, smiling. A friend who is finally learning how to build a fence. I put the phone back in my pocket, feeling the vibration of the message fading, but the warmth remaining. My son was right at that dinner table a year ago. If the old Margaret Thornton, the enabler, the checkbook, the ghost, had disappeared, no one would have missed her. She was useless. But that woman was dead. She died the night I walked out into the snow. The woman who remained, the woman standing in the garden with dirt on her knees, and a grandson who loved her. That woman was essential. I picked up the toolbox. Come on, Ollie, I said. Let's go inside. I think we earned some ice cream. We walked toward the house. The sun was shining. The house was solid. The debt was being paid. I had vanished to save them. And in the silence of my absence, my son had finally found his voice. It was a good trade. Here's the deep lesson I took from the ashes of my old life. I spent 40 years thinking that providing for my family meant protecting them from struggle. But I was wrong. By shielding my son from the weight of the world, I crippled him. True love is not about being a safety net. It's about teaching your children how to fly, even if it means letting them fall first and sometimes learning to rebuild themselves from the ground up. By vanishing, I forced the real men in my family to finally appear. A legacy is not what you leave for someone. It's what you leave in them. So, I have to wonder, when is tough love too tough? And what are we truly sacrificing when we continually bail out those we claim to love? You know, looking back at Maggie's incredible journey, it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about family, love, and what it truly means to build a life. It's easy to judge her methods, to call them harsh, even cruel. But what would you have done in her shoes, when faced with such profound disrespect, betrayal, and manipulation from your own child? Was her radical disappearance a necessary act of tough love, or a step too far? If this story sparked something in you, perhaps a memory, a reflection on your own family dynamics, or a strong opinion about Maggie's extraordinary methods, please, don't keep it to yourself. Share your perspective in the comments below. I'm reading every single one. And tell me, honestly, where do you draw the line between protecting your loved ones and letting them learn the hardest lessons life has to offer?